1 week season.
What is going on, OWS fam? Welcome to the week 9 edition of the OWS Angles podcast. I am your host. I am your guest. I am JMToWin. As always, throw this baby on 1.5x speed or 2x speed. And let's get started with a week that's a bit different from what we've had in recent weeks. So today we're going to take a look at the shape of this slate, what is defining this slate. We're going to look at a few positions through the lens of what is defining this slate in my position, in from my perspective, and then why the slate is this way, and then how I'm attacking this slate from a strategy standpoint as a result of the way that the slate is. We had, real quickly before we dive in, we had travel on Tuesday. We had switching time zones. We traveled from the East Coast back to here. You see back in my normal surroundings with my normal backdrop, so back home. So switching time zones, traveling with the kids on a full day, 12-hour travel day, and then getting the kids adjusted back to this time zone, squeezing in all my research and work on the week, and then also carving out space for Halloween last night where the kids were up late. I was up late compared to what our bodies are used to from East Coast time zone. So bear with me if my mind kind of stalls at any points. Really quickly, if you're new here, what this podcast is, if you're new here and you're still around, what this podcast is all about. So we often talk about how DFS is not a game of picking players, it's a game of strategy. And the more you understand the strategy and the more you lean into the strategy of DFS, the more money you're going to make over time. DFS is also a game of trying to get first place finishes because that's where most of the money is. The more you think about how you're building your roster strategically and from a ceiling perspective toward a first place finish. In fact, what we see all the time is players who are popular because they're consistent scorers. Consistent scorers without high ceiling are great for cash games being double ups or head to heads. Consistent scorers without high ceiling have really no value in tournaments. You're paying a lot for too low of a score for what you really need from that price tag. And so we talk about those types of things. And then there was one other thing that I was going to say, and it slipped my mind. So we'll move on to what's next. But yeah, so basically we use this podcast. We have on 1 week season, we break down all the games throughout the week. So Thursday, Friday, you get all of the game breakdowns. We have our DFS interpretations in the game breakdowns where we kind of highlight the individual plays from each game that we like. And then we have the scroll where we have all of our late week content. And in that late week content, we have player pools. You have my player pool, you have Mike's player pool, you have Sonic's MME player pool. Mike, an extremely profitable DFS player on DraftKings and FanDuel. Sonic, an extremely profitable large field tournament player, Millie Maker winner. And then I've had a lot of success in high stakes, smaller field contests and also larger field contests, but kind of focus more on like what my tighter player pool is, and then mention some of my other player pool components. And then we have other content in the scroll that's also focused on, players that we like. But really the core purpose of the scroll is to hit on a bunch of strategy content. The core purpose even of our player pool content is to hit on strategy angles on those players. And then we have the Slate podcast on Saturdays for Inner Circle members, where again, Hilo and Xanamir break down the entire slate from a strategy perspective. Hilo, who's taking game theory courses at Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Northwestern, is also a former Navy fighter pilot, so super sharp guy. Xanamir, who Hilo calls the human computer. And so they break down things on the slate from a strategy perspective, going position by position. And so again, there's this mix of, yes, we need a good player pool, but everybody at this point in the life cycle of DFS has a pretty good player pool. So it's not just about the player pool. Now, we tend to see, because we pay attention to things other people don't pay attention to. We pay attention to coaches. We pay attention to game environments in ways that other people don't. So we do tend to get onto players that other people aren't on. And sometimes our edge is just simply having a better player pool. But oftentimes it's more about how we build those players, the players from that player pool, onto rosters. That was the other thing I was going to say, was that DFS is a game of rosters, not a game of players. It's a game of rosters. And so we talk a lot about roster construction and how we can build rosters that maximize our chances of a first place finish. So the Angles podcast is one piece of this puzzle for kind of what I cover throughout the week. You can get my game-by-game DFS interpretations in the NFL Edge. You can get my player pool in the scroll. But in the Angles podcast, I'd like to kind of look at what I'm seeing from a macro view on the slate from a strategy perspective. And again, what really defines the slate. So actually, before we dive in, if you're not an Inner Circle member, really quick shout, there's on the checkout page on OWS, there's a 40% discount code. It's OWS40. You can apply that, take 40% off of rest of season OWS access. If you sign up for Inner Circle right now, we talked about Props Insider last week and just how sharp it is to just get the Props Insider package if you have sports betting access, because you don't have to do any research. Props are inefficient, but it takes a lot of time and research to find inefficient plus EV bets, and the Props Insider service does that for you. And eventually sportsbooks are going to figure out how to close this loophole where you can just make money on props, right? But they haven't figured it out yet. And so as long as it's there, it's sharp to just scoop up that money. So currently Inner Circle members get 10 days of free access to Props Insider. So if you sign up with that code OWS40, you'll get rest of season Inner Circle access. You'll also get a second email with a 10-day code for or instruction on how to get that 10 days of free access to Props Insider. So I wanted to shout that out. Okay, so what defines this slate? To me, what defines this slate is pretty flat ownership. And you could say that flat ownership is the fruit, not the root, right? So we can get down to the root of why there's flat ownership. We'll talk about that as we get kind of deeper into this show. But what we really care about is the fruit, what's on the surface, what's really going to impact the slate. And that is the fact that ownership is kind of spread out on this particular week. So I'm going to take a look at the quarterback position. Then I'm going to take a look at running backs and wide receivers who are projected to be owned at 10% and above. And then we'll kind of talk about why this is this way this week, what this means for this week. So this really stood out to me because this morning I was up at 5 a.m. with my daughter, who woke up kind of late for if she were still on the East Coast, but woke up early here. And I got up and was like, well, I got a lot of work to do, so might as well dive in. And so I was looking through ownership projections and just realizing, like, man, like there's nothing that typically, recent weeks we've talked about this. I go through ownership projections and it's like, man, why is the field taking this guy at 20% and this guy at 20%, and this guy at 20%, this guy at 25%? And this week doesn't really give us that. This week gives us more. Well, I looked at it, I was like, oh, wow, nobody's really super popular from the field. So we'll start at the quarterback position currently. Now, this is Friday ownership projections, which is largely algorithm driven, which also means it's largely driven off of what projection systems spin out. So there's the early week ownership projections across the industry. There's a general assumption that a lot of people are going to build using an optimizer. Optimizers are going to leverage projection systems in order to build optimized rosters. And then that's going to largely dictate ownership. That's going to dictate who's being talked about around the space. And then there's some other components from there that go into ownership projections. Then as we get deeper into the week, then there's a little bit more human component of like, okay, well, let's bump up this guy. Let's bump this guy down. This guy's not really being talked about. People are going to be thinking this way about this guy. So take all of this with a small grain of salt. But generally speaking, this does give a good sense of where ownership is going to land as we move deeper into the week and as we get into Sunday. So at quarterback, we have Geno Smith and Daniel Jones projected for north of 10%. Now, what we see with these two guys, 5,800 on Geno Smith, 5,200 on Daniel Jones. So first off, that expresses a lack. In fact, let's go down to the next two guys on the list. Next two guys, Dak Prescott, 6,300, Gardner Minshew, 4,500, and those guys are only 7% and 6.4% projected ownership. So what we see here is the field basically saying, I don't know that I want to spend the salary on the high-priced quarterbacks. Now, there's a component here that Hilo always talks about. You can find these types of thoughts in the end around in the scroll and in the Slate podcast. But Hilo always talks about, if salary allocation is moving this way, we can always consider differentiating our rosters by just having a different salary structure than the field. But we also want to ask ourselves if that's actually sharp in terms of like, what's the ceiling you're going to get for these players? What are the chances of these players hitting that type of ceiling? So you don't want to just blindly say, oh, well, everybody's paying down at quarterback, I'll pay up at quarterback. But that is something you can always think about in terms of how you can differentiate your roster. Because if you pay up at quarterback, now your whole roster looks different when we recognize that most of the field is going to be chasing these lower priced quarterbacks. But again, four highest owned quarterbacks. 10% is kind of high. We often get like a guy projected at 14%, something like that. Last week, Bo Nix early week was projected for 14%. By the time we got to Sunday, Jameis Winston, people kind of came around on him being the sharpest, lower cost quarterback by Sunday. I might have been partly responsible for that, but I can't take full credit for the spike in ownership that we unfortunately saw on Jameis. But I know that in high dollar contests, he was up to 20% owned by the time Sunday kicked off. And so we often see like at least a few quarterbacks kind of up in that 13, 14, 15+% range. So top two guys, only 10%. And then by the time we get down to the fourth highest owned guy, we're all the way down to 6.4% projected ownership. And again, all these guys kind of cheap in this spot. And so we're kind of looking at people saying, well, yeah, I don't have a ton of confidence here. Obviously, Dak Prescott, we can paint the picture of him having a big game. But a lot of people kind of saying, yeah, like I don't have a lot of confidence here. Let's pay down to quarterback. Daniel Jones is capable of the random 30-pointer, and Geno Smith throws the ball a lot. He's not going to kill you, and he might get you 23, 24, 25. And again, Dak Prescott capable of the 30-pointer. Gardner Minshew, he's only 4,500, and it's not a great defense that he's playing against. So who knows what can happen there, right? That's kind of the sentiment that we're seeing developing around the quarterback position. And then we've got, like I said, fourth highest owned guy projected at 6.4% owned. Fifth is 5.8, sixth is 5.4, seventh is 5.4, eighth is 4.9, ninth is 4.8, 10th is 4.7. So 4.7 to 6.4 is quarterbacks 10 through 3, right? In terms of projected ownership, right? So we're seeing things just really spread out across the quarterback position. So these quarterbacks are Matthew Stafford, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow, Kyler Murray, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson. So we're starting to get up into some higher price guys. Joe Burrow and Kyler's up in that higher 6K range. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson. Then we've got Jameis Winston. We've got Justin Herbert. We've got Jaden Daniels. All these guys projected at 4% and above. So that's 14 quarterbacks in all projected for 4% and above. 11 of those quarterbacks projected for, or 10 of those quarterbacks projected for 4% to 5.8% in ownership. And so again, just the field really spreading out their exposure. We can go down the list from there, but basically like every quarterback on this slate is projecting to see some level of exposure from the field on this particular week. Let's move over to the running back position. Running backs projected for north of 10% exposure. We have Alvin Kamara up at the top at 21.3%. Playing Carolina, people love chasing this matchup against Carolina. Carolina, really bad run defense, as we've explored throughout the year. Chasing running backs against Carolina has not actually been profitable this year. The closest we got was Bijan Robinson, and he got out-carried by Tyler Algier. And that's a perfect illustration of why it hasn't been profitable to chase running backs against Carolina, because teams are controlling the game against Carolina so much that lead running back isn't getting a ton of touches in a great matchup. They're just getting their normal number of touches, or oftentimes fewer touches than normal in a great matchup. And so they're not really being able to smash their typical production. So Alvin Kamara has had the ribs issue. He's got the broken hand. So we're basically saying, yeah, hopefully Alvin Kamara just smashes on somewhat limited volume, or that the Panthers keep this game close and Kamara ends up seeing heavier volume. Now, I do think there's a really, speaking of strategy and roster construction, there's a really unique angle to play with Alvin Kamara, where instead of just betting on Kamara smashing on lower volume in a soft matchup, because keep in mind, Kamara, he's put up one game that you would really want at his price tag this year now, and that game was an absolute monster smash game. He put up 47 DraftKings points against Dallas in week 2, but his other scores, 22 against Carolina in week 1, the same defense, 15.7, 24.9, 12.6, 17.4, 8.4, 18.2. That's only 3 games over 20 DraftKings points. And this guy costs $7.8K in salary, is going to be potentially the most popular running back on the slate. You really want him to score 30 plus DraftKings points. He's only sniffed that once this year, right? So you're either saying he has a monster game on this, typical, let's say his recent carries, 10, 7, 13, 11, obviously very involved in the passing attack as well. So he's going to get the touches, but you're basically hoping he has a monster game on limited volume, or moderate volume, we'll call it. Or you're hoping this game stays close and he ends up seeing higher volume than normal. So I do think there's an interesting angle to play here, where instead of just playing Kamara, you play Kamara with pieces from the Panthers. An interesting way to play that could be Bryce Young, right? Bryce Young, who nobody's going to want to play, but he's 4,400. Jalen Coker could really emerge as his number one target. Obviously, there's Xavier Legette as well, but you throw Coker on that roster, you're spending $8K in salary for your quarterback and your wide receiver, and you're painting a picture of them actually putting up points. Bryce Young's not drawing dead for a nice game, right? He put up a 20-pointer last year. He put up a 25-pointer last year. This is a really soft matchup. And with Derek Carr back, Chris Olave back, 4/5 of the Saints offensive line is healthy now. Like, this is a spot where the Saints could put up a ton of points and the Panthers could be chasing against a soft defense. And so the Bryce Young plus Jalen Coker plus Alvin Kamara, that kind of tells the story of, okay, Bryce Young's doing well, and they're keeping this game closer, and that's forcing Alvin Kamara to play more snaps and stay on the field. And so I think that those are the ways to kind of approach the Alvin Kamara play. Just some side notes on that. Tony Pollard projected at 20% owned. Don't even get me started on this one, a guy who hasn't topped 20 DraftKings points yet this year. Good player, tremendous matchup. He's on a mediocre offense, and just his ceiling isn't that high. So I talked about this on the block party with Pete Overzet, but part of the DraftKings pricing algorithm is recent performance. Another part of the DraftKings pricing algorithm is ownership. So that's why we see, sometimes we'll see these guys who it's like, oh, they're still at 6.1K, even though they put up 2 big games in the last 3 or 4 weeks. Well, it's because people are not rostering that guy, and so they kind of stay at that price range. Well, Tony Pollard was so popular when he was in the high 5Ks and the low 6Ks, the DraftKings has continued to bump up his price, but his production was solid when he was at that lower price tag. It doesn't really match up with his higher price tag. So just some thoughts there. Not to say that Tony Pollard can't hit, but again, we're talking about what's likeliest to happen. What are our high confidence plays? Tony Pollard at this price tag, probably not a high confidence play. Could actually miss this week with the foot issue. So if he does, then you've got Tajay Spears at 4,700, or if Tajay Spears with the hamstring misses, then you've got Julius Chestnut at, I think he's 4,200, maybe he's 4K. So then this backfield becomes very interesting because the matchup is extremely soft. But we've got 20% on Tony Pollard, who, he's a guy who, if you really looked at it through a logical lens, you would be like, yeah, he's overpriced. And yet he can draw this type of ownership because why? Because nothing's really standing out on this slate. We have Chase Brown, a guy who's seeing 12 to 15 carries per game, 2 to 3 targets. So not a hefty workload. He's at 18% predicted ownership. Chuba Hubbard, 17.5%. We did get news this morning that Jonathan Brooks will not be playing. So not that Brooks would have stepped in for a big workload, but he could have taken 4 or 5 carries away, and Miles Sanders still takes a couple of carries away, and then Chuba Hubbard becomes a little bit less valuable. But Chuba Hubbard, 17.5%. Bijan Robinson, this phenomenal matchup against Dallas, 17.1%. James Conner, basically just a bet on workload, 16.7%. DeAndre Swift, 6,400, 14.2%. He's played obviously really well 4 games in a row. They're featuring him in this offense. J.K. Dobbins, again, another one. Don't ask me to try to explain this one, but 7K price tag, 13.2%. Kenneth Walker, 12.2%. Devon Achane, 11.7%. Alexander Madison, 10.5%. So again, just this, like, we've got, 10 guys who are projected for 10% or higher ownership this week. Is that more guys than 10? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 guys projected for 10% or higher ownership this week. No guys projected for more than 22% ownership this week. You could poke holes in several of these guys, and maybe even the guys I like, other people can come through and poke holes on those guys. And so again, just sort of this spread out pool of ownership at the running back position. Nobody really separating, but then a lot of guys north of 10% projected ownership. Let's swing over to wide receiver. So at wide receiver, we have 10 players projected for higher than 10% ownership. Let's start down at the lowest end. So we've got Jacoby Myers, who's got this kind of bigger role in this offense. We're typically going to see 7, 8, 9, maybe even 10 targets. So at his price tag, that's just really nice volume. So 5,300, 10.5% projected ownership. CeeDee Lamb, interesting guy to think about this week, because among all the players on this slate, who's capable of putting up 40? We've seen 30-point scores become much more rare than they used to be in the past. So now if somebody puts up 40's always been valuable. But in the past, it was like somebody puts up 40, 3 or 4 guys put up 30 to 33, 34. And so if you didn't get the 40-pointer, but you get the 33-pointer or 2 of the 30-pointers, you're still within range of being able to win a tournament on that week. And again, all the money is at the top in tournaments. So that's what we want to be thinking about. How do we win it? Not how do we cash in tournaments? How do we win a tournament on this week? And so now we're at this point where we're just not seeing a lot of 30-point scores across the NFL. And then we've got CeeDee Lamb, who put up 40 plus multiple times last year. I think it was 3 times last year. Maybe it was 4 times last year. He put up 40 plus last week. Now, this offense does not look good. All of the advanced metrics for this offense say that it's a below average offense, right? And the brand name on Cowboys offense is sort of masking how bad this offense has been and the perception of DFS players. But CeeDee Lamb is capable of putting up a 40 plus point score. So one of the questions I want to ask myself is, what happens if he puts up 40 plus points? If he puts up 40 plus points and nobody else puts up more than 30, you probably are not winning a tournament without CeeDee Lamb this week. So CeeDee Lamb, 10.5% owned. I would think he'll end up getting up a little bit higher than that, but we'll see if he does. Ray McLeod, 10.7% owned. We'll jump up to the top with Drake London, 22.2% owned. So another one, not quite the same as Kamara, but I want to really encourage you. If you are playing these guys this week, please do not play them as one-offs. The percentage chances, less so for Ray McLeod, right? He could trip into a big play or trip into a touchdown or trip into a multi-touchdown game. But the pathway to these guys, particularly Drake London, Darnell Mooney, the pathway to them putting up tournament-winning games is the Falcons having to throw the ball a lot. Drake London in particular, his role, his profile as a player is not one that is going to yield 30-plus DraftKings points on low volume outside of just totally fluky outcomes. He's not going to hit for a lot of big plays. He's not going to get tons of yards after the catch. So what you really need is probably a 2-touchdown game, maybe even with a busted play along the way to get him up to the 100-yard bonus in order for him to post a tourney winner on lower volume, right? So if he sees 6, 7, 8 targets, it's going to be really hard for him to put up 30-plus DraftKings points, which you really want at his price tag, especially at high ownership. Now, why do I think he might not see 10, 11, 12 targets? Well, the Cowboys defense has been one of the worst in the NFL. The Cowboys offense has been in the bottom third of the league, and the Cowboys have consistently fallen behind good teams. They fell behind the Saints. They fell behind the Ravens 28-6. They fell behind whoever it was a couple weeks ago, 27-10. They fell behind the Lions and lost 47-9. And so are the Falcons in that class of teams? Maybe not, but the Falcons have a really good rushing attack. In fact, the Falcons are, I think, 21st in the NFL in pass rate over expectation. They run the ball about 4 percentage points more often than the typical scenario would call for them to run the ball. So they lean run balanced on offense. And then Dallas is facing the second highest opponent rush play rate in the NFL because their run defense is so bad. In fact, we had this stat in DFS interpretations this week, but in terms of expected points added, EPA, a run play against Dallas is like the 7th best play call in the NFL behind a pass play to 6 other teams, including Dallas, a pass play against Dallas. But point being, like, calling a run against Dallas is more valuable than calling a pass against 75% of the teams in the NFL, even though in terms of EPA, running the ball is hugely devalued. In terms of EPA, passing the ball is a much better way to go. And yet against the Cowboys, running the ball is more valuable than passing the ball against more than 75% of teams in the NFL. So that's just something to think about in terms of how soft this matchup is on the ground, what the Falcons are going to be seeing. If they're looking at the analytics, if they're just breaking down the film, they're going to see, hey, this is a spot where we can really run the ball. And teams tend to run the ball against Dallas at a higher rate than they typically run the ball. And the Falcons already run the ball at a higher rate than the typical team would. So we should expect the Falcons to lean more run heavy than normal in this spot. And so the chances of Kirk Cousins getting up to 35, 38 pass attempts when he's typically in this like 29, 30 pass attempt range, the chances of that are really low unless the game develops in a particular way that forces the Falcons to be throwing the ball more often. So that would be Dallas figuring out a way to sell out to stop the run, which doesn't seem particularly likely, or it would be Dallas scoring a bunch of points, jumping out to a lead themselves, and then forcing Atlanta to come back. And so really, realistically, for Drake London to hit, he's hit once this year. It was a game where Kirk Cousins threw the ball over 50 times, where he threw for 500 yards, where Kirk Cousins hit, where Darnell Mooney also hit, where Kyle Pitts also hit, where Ray McLeod also hit. And so if you are not stacking up Kirk Cousins on these Drake London rosters, you're really doing yourself a disservice. You're basically saying, at high ownership, I'm just hoping to get lucky. Now, could we fast forward to Sunday evening and it's like, oh, JM, Drake London put up 30 points on 8 targets and you didn't need Kirk Cousins. Absolutely. Crazy things can happen in the NFL, but we want to think through what I always say is if we could play out the slate 100 times, right? We want to think through what would make us the most money. What would make us the most money is not playing Drake London as a one-off. And so excuse the little rant there. I had this for years with Keenan Allen. You only play Keenan Allen in games where you expect heavy target volume, and yet he was always 20% owned week in and week out. We had it with Michael Pittman for a little while when he was over 7K and didn't have a great quarterback or wasn't in an offense that was throwing the ball a ton. We had it with Michael Thomas back in the day with Drew Brees, and now we have it with Drake London and Kirk Cousins. I'll keep saying it throughout the season, but there you have my thoughts on that. Okay, going back down. So Ray McLeod was 10.7%. Malik Neighbors, I actually don't get this ownership. It might bump up a little bit. Malik Neighbors has more games of 26 plus DraftKings points this year than any other wide receiver on this slate. He's still affordable at 7,500, 13.3% projected ownership. Puka Nacua, 14.7, Tyreek, 15.1, Ladd McConkey, 15.8, Chris Olave, 16.4, Cedric Tillman, our guy, 18.3, and then again, Drake London, 22.2%. So once again, we see the spot where there's nobody up at like 26, 30%. There's only 2 guys above 16.4% projected ownership. But then we've got 10 guys above 10%. We've got, 3 guys between 10 and 11%. We go below that. We've got Jamar Chase at 9.2, Waddle at 8.9, Amon-Ra St. Brown at 8.1, Parker Washington at 8. Next group, we have 3 guys in the 7% range. And so again, just very spread out ownership at the wide receiver position. That's really what is defining this week as a whole, is this spread out ownership. So why is ownership as flat as it is this week? It's because nothing really stands out. So if you're thinking about ownership being an encapsulation of what 150 roster set might look like, if you just took 150 roster set from the field, it would be betting on so many different things. Whereas there are other weeks where if you built 150, if you just took ownership projections and kind of built your exposures off of that, well, then your 150 rosters would kind of have some concentrated bets. It'd be like, I'm really betting on this spot, or I'm really betting on this game, I'm really betting on this set of players, as opposed to a week like this, where if you built 150 rosters just based off of the field's ownership, you would have this stack and this stack and this stack and this stack and this stack, like just like spread across, where you've got a few rosters on this offense, a few rosters on this offense, a handful of rosters, 15, 20% on this running back, 15% on this running back, 13% on this running back, 11 on this running back, 10 on this running back. And that's kind of how the field is attacking this week, because they're kind of looking at this slate and nothing really stands out. So why does nothing really stand out? Well, let's go ahead and look at some of these game environments. So the Cowboys and Falcons, obviously this high total, and we're seeing a lot of ownership piling up on these two teams. So that's one spot where it's like, okay, people are saying, okay, we can attack this particular spot. Next game, we got Broncos at Ravens. We know the Ravens implied for 28 DraftKings, 28 real life points. That's the highest implied total on the slate, but not drawing a lot of ownership. Well, why? Well, Lamar is expensive. Derrick Henry is expensive. Zay Flowers is expensive, and they're playing this really tough Broncos defense where you're like, yeah, maybe they find a way to score 28 points, but is that because they're putting up a ton of yards? Is that because they're being pushed by Bo Nix and the Broncos? Or is it because maybe the Ravens are getting some short fields, or maybe they're returning a punt or whatever, right? Maybe they have kind of a middling yardage total, and they score 3 or 4 touchdowns, but maybe the points don't pile up in terms of fantasy scoring for any of these guys to really be useful this week. Perfectly reasonable way to look at that game. Then you got the Dolphins and Bills. Bills, same type of thing, right? Where Josh Allen has absolutely owned the Dolphins throughout his career. We'll have the numbers on that in the player grid, but Josh Allen has had no trouble in this matchup against the Dolphins throughout his career. The last 6 games against kind of iterations of this Dolphins defense, he had the 9.8 pointer to start the year. All his other games were 29 plus DraftKings points, including a couple of 39 DraftKings points against this Dolphins defense. But now we've got Joe Brady calling the plays, and this offense has really morphed into this rushing attack. Well, we also have James Cook, who running backs on this slate who have scored 28 plus DraftKings points more than once. Derrick Henry has scored 28 plus 4 times. Saquon scored 28 plus 3 times. James Cook has done it twice. That's it. No other running back on the slate has scored 28 plus multiple times. But again, when James Cook misses, he's getting these like 7-point scores or 13-point scores. And it's hard to kind of gauge where he's going to have this higher volume. And so this is another spot where people are like, I don't know that I want to chase the Bills. And then, the Dolphins, we're getting some Waddle exposure. We're getting some Tyreek Hill exposure. But we also, if you dig in, that Sean McDermott has absolutely owned Mike McDaniel in this matchup. The Dolphins have never had a good game against the Bills in this McDaniel versus McDermott matchup. So going to Buffalo, it's actually going to be sub 40 degrees. And so, it's pretty easy to see the Dolphins not being an attractive team to chase. Saints and Panthers, kind of drawing some ownership on that one. So we'll skip over that one. Raiders and Bengals kind of drawing some ownership. But again, this speaks to, Raiders only have a 19-point implied team total. Bengals, we know that the Bengals need points to pile up. Zach Taylor is a reactive coach. They need points to pile up across Burrow's whole career. He has only posted tournament winners against the Ravens when the Bengals were like, hey, let's be proactive and just score as many points as we can against our division rival, or in games where it's a back and forth type of game. So if you're not expecting a back and forth type of game here, it's hard to get too excited about the Bengals in this spot. And then the Raiders have a 19-point implied team total. Yeah, they've got some cheap pieces, and the Bengals aren't great on defense. So let's throw some ownership on these guys, right? It's kind of how the field is seeing this spot. Chargers and Browns, we have two teams implied to score under 22 points, but there's some cheap pieces, and the Browns are going to be aggressive on offense and the Browns are going to be aggressive on defense. So there's this outside chance that the Browns hit some big plays on offense or give up some big plays on defense. So we're seeing kind of a little bit of ownership developing around these two teams, but not a ton because, again, low implied team totals, and probably we don't see explosions from this game. We got the Commanders at the Giants. So Commanders only implied to score 24 points here, one of the best offenses in football, but the Giants, one of the best red zone defenses in football. And so as long as the Giants aren't giving Washington short fields, it could be one of these games kind of similar to last week where, Washington's able to find a way to move the ball, but it's just harder to score points. They had a game like that similar to that earlier in the year against the Giants where they settled for 6 field goals. And obviously Jaden Daniels could break through and score a couple touchdowns. Then all of a sudden, that becomes a 24-point game or 27-point game or 30-point game. But our likely scenario here is, we probably don't get great scores in terms of fantasy. And actually there's nobody on the Commanders who has produced a 4x score compared to their salary heading into this week. And then we got the Giants. And so similar type of thing, right? Like Tyrone Tracy looks like he's in a clear concussion protocol. So he'll start catching some ownership, but Tyrone Tracy, sharp play, Malik Neighbors, sharp play, but the Giants applied to score only 20 points. So how excited can we get there? Patriots and Titans, two teams implied to score under 21 points. So outside of Tony Pollard in this nice matchup against the Patriots run defense, it's hard to get too excited about this particular spot. Bears at Cardinals. This is actually an interesting one to highlight. Cardinals are implied to score 23 points, which would be the best game any team has had against the Bears this year. So probably they end up below that, right? And then the Bears implied to score 21.5. So that doesn't draw much attention over to the Bears side. And the Cardinal side, we know you can't really throw the ball against the Bears. So people are just like, James Conner, home favorite, gets a big workload. That's where we're putting our ownership in this spot, but we're not too excited about it. So, not a ton of ownership. Eagles and Jags. This is the spot where Eagles are the run heaviest team in the NFL across the last 3 weeks since they came out of their bye. They very clearly assessed what they were doing, shifted the way they were running that offense with Kellen Moore, and have decided to lean on the run quite a bit more. But the Jags are easy to attack through the air, one of the easiest teams in the NFL to attack through the air. They're not that easy to attack on the ground. So, maybe the Eagles shift a little pass heavy here. That gives us a little bit of interest in Hurts and A.J. Brown, but then also the Jags are missing Christian Kirk. Looks like they could be missing Brian Thomas Jr. Right now. He's setting up as a game time call. Might even be missing Gabe Davis, right? So then you're like, okay, how are the Jags going to move the ball against the Eagles? How many points can the Jags put up? Even if the Eagles are like, we'll go a little pass heavier to start the game, does that last? Do the Jags keep this game close enough for us to really get tournament winning scores out of the Eagles passing attack? And so we see kind of lower ownership on this spot. Packers and Lions, one of the clear spots on the slate for points to pile up. The Lions are not going to be confused by what Jeff Hafley does on defense because the Lions kind of just do their own thing. They don't have a system that Hafley can kind of exploit the rules of. Ben Johnson's going to figure out ways to attack this Packers defense similar to what we saw from the Lions against the Vikings. And then the Lions don't really have anything they can throw at the Packers. It's going to really throw the Packers off. So certainly upside in this game in terms of scoring, But then you've got really high price tags on the Lions, a team that is consistently throwing the ball 25 or fewer times per game. This isn't a spot where they're necessarily obviously going to be forced to heavier passing volume than normal. And then we've got the Packers side where it's going to be hard to run the ball. They're probably going to have to pass the ball, but there's always that question of, yeah, but who benefits, right? They spread the ball around so much that who benefits there. So again, another game where there's nothing that really stands out as like, oh man, like we could get 30 points here, we get 35 points here. And so that becomes a game where it's like, yeah, let's get some exposure on this, but nothing too heavy. The field doesn't want to express too much confidence in that game. And then the last game is the Rams at the Seahawks. Rams have Kupp and Nakua and Kyron Williams all healthy or somewhat healthy, all on the field together. Seahawks hopefully get DK Metcalf back. Currently doesn't look likely. That would obviously elevate the potential for this game environment if DK Metcalf is on the field versus off the field. But another spot where, yeah, people are kind of drawn to this game, but expensive price tags on the Rams. And then when there's no DK Metcalf, some question marks around how good this Seahawks offense can actually be. And so again, we're kind of getting this spread out ownership from this game as well. So I wanted to cover that. I wanted to kind of cover what these things look like by position. I wanted to cover why the ownership is flat from a standpoint of what the field is seeing and like how these games shape up and how projection systems and DFS players are going to be looking at these games. And so how do we attack this from a strategy perspective? Well, when ownership is flat, we're likely to see plenty of rosters with decent scores. You can contrast this with weeks where there's really concentrated ownership. And when there's really concentrated ownership, if there's like several guys who are going to be 30% owned, and especially several guys who are going to be 30% owned on rosters together. So take last week, for example, where Cedric Tillman didn't end up being quite 30% owned, but he was certainly higher owned than we expected when we were hyping him up throughout the week. But Cedric Tillman, I think maybe he was in high dollar contests, he was 40% owned. And then Tyreek Hill was 50% owned. And, there's some other guys last week who had really high ownership. And so if you have a week like that, where there's really high owned guys and like they fit together, right? It's not like Tyreek Hill and another really expensive guy. It's Tyreek Hill and Cedric Tillman, or Jamar Chase and Cedric Tillman, where you can use Cedric Tillman to open up the space for this other guy. And so these guys are going to be played together. Well, on those weeks, the score that those popular players provide will really determine how the week plays out. Because Cedric Tillman put up 30 plus last week and then got 3 points taken off when they adjusted his receiving yards down to 99 from 100. Lost me some money when that happened. I know Hilo lost $16K when the Broncos gave up their late touchdown and then that stat adjustment. So I think OWS is obviously very heavy on Cedric Tillman last week. And so we all moved back a little bit when they did that. But before that happened, he scored 30 points. And then let's say that Tyreek Hill had also scored 30 points. And a lot of rosters had these two guys together. At least 20% of rosters had these two guys together because each guy was 50% owned. You got to assume there's some level of overlap there where one guy's helping to open up the salary for the other guy. And so let's say that both these guys score 30 plus points and they're on 20% of rosters. Well, 20%, that's the cashing portion of a tournament field. Usually about the top 20% finish in the money. And so if you don't get these 60 points from these two guys who cost just over 10K in salary, that's almost 6x their combined salary. Well, then you are way behind the field, but now you still have 20% of the tournament field that, yeah, they started with 60 points that they all have together, but they're all still competing against each other for those first place finishes. So now they have 7 roster spots left to try to separate from one another. So you can kind of see how when popular players, especially popular players who fit together on a roster, hit, that really changes the target score you need in order to win a tournament. On the flip side, if a guy is 5% owned and puts up 30 points, and another guy is 7% owned and puts up 30 points, and those two guys aren't necessarily connected to one another in such a way that they're going to be played on a lot of rosters together, or they're in a similar price range where they're almost never played on rosters together, now you have an opportunity for that to not really dramatically change the score that's required in order to win a tournament. So when we have this spread out type of exposure, it's harder to gauge like what you need to jump over, right? It's harder to say, okay, if this guy misses, I need to outscore him. Or if these groups of guys miss, I need to be able to outscore the rosters that have these guys. And instead it's like, somebody's going to have some combination that's good. It's less likely that somebody has unless a game environment takes off, right? Somebody's going to have some combination of players that's good. Somebody's going to have some combination of of players that's good enough to separate from everybody else, but you're less likely to see huge clumps of rosters moving up the field together. So what I want to do on a week like this is two things. One, I want to look at game environments, because if there is a game environment that takes off, then you have this opportunity for a game environment takes off, you're on that game environment, the field is not on that game environment, and you're picking up tons of points, right? So then you're getting 4 bets right at once, or 5 players right at once, because this one game environment took off and you were heavy on that game environment. So I want to be looking at that, or I want to be looking at guys on my roster who can score 25 plus points, right? So if I'm looking at guys who cost 5K, I'm not saying they have to score 25 plus. Most guys are priced 5K because they're not going to score 25 plus, but I want that to be within their reasonable range of outcomes. And if I need to, I always want to tell the story of how does this guy put up his 25 plus points. Let me tell the story of how this guy puts up his 25 plus points, and can that happen without the game environment cooperating? So we talked about Drake London, right? If you're playing Drake London, you're really, whether you are intending to or not, you're telling a story of Kirk Cousins having to throw the ball a ton, or of some fluky thing happening. Well, you really don't want to be betting on just some fluky thing happening, because if you're doing that on one spot, you're probably doing that on another and another and another. And the chances of 6 or 7 fluky things happening all together on one roster together are extraordinarily low, and you're just going to be bleeding out money all the time. So can this guy score 20 plus DraftKings points? Can he score 25 plus DraftKings points? How does he do it? And if he does it, is there anything else that would also be happening in this game that I should also be capitalizing on or taking advantage of? Now, that's not to say that that's always going to be the case. There's going to be times where it's like, oh yeah, this guy can score 25 plus points because, he can catch 8 passes for 100 yards and score a touchdown, right? Like, if that's the case, that doesn't necessarily mean that game environment is taking off, or that guy's quarterback is taking off, or whatever the case might be. But we want to ask, how realistic is it for this player to score the type of score? And then also understand how that would happen, so that we can know if there's something else that we should be doing on that roster to basically say, hey, if I'm getting this bet right, there's probably other things in this game that I would be getting right as well. So let me take advantage of that. If we're getting up into these 6K players, right, 25 points has to be like something that you think can happen about 25% of the time. Or at least, DraftKings has gotten aggressive with pricing, at least say 15, 20% of the time, this guy can score 24 points. If you're looking at a guy who's 6K and you're like, yeah, I mean, like, he might score 24 points 10% of the time in this matchup, but you probably don't want that guy. So look for the guys who can score 24 plus DraftKings points somewhat regularly, and then ask, do they have a path to 30? Once we're above the 6K price range, really even the 5K guys, but especially once we're up above the 6K price range, we want to always be asking, does this guy have a path to 30? Is there a way for this guy to score 30 DraftKings points? And if the answer is no, you probably don't want them on your roster. So I said this on the block party, but I'm okay taking, let's take Christian Watson, for example. He could score 6, he could score 25. I'm okay taking that. I'm okay getting the 6-pointer if that means I'm targeting the 25-pointer. And I would much rather do that than take the guy who can score, let's say, same price point, and he can score 12 to 18. Well, does the 18-pointer help me win a tournament? No. Now, we don't get to play out the week 100 times. We get to play it out once. So playing it out once, maybe Christian Watson scores 7 and this other guy scores 18. And I'm way behind the rosters that have this other guy. But also, if I had this other guy and I got those 18 points, I'm probably not winning a tournament. 18 at 5K, yeah, that might be okay. But let's say 12 to 16 points, right? I get those 16 points. I'm probably not winning a tournament. Certainly this guy's not helping me win a tournament at that score, at that price tag. And so I'm okay taking the guy who has a broader range of outcomes, but a higher ceiling, than taking the guy who has a narrower range of outcomes, but you're taking him because he has a higher floor. He's going to hit more consistently. Like, we don't want to be thinking that way in tournaments. So on a week like this, what I really want to be thinking about is essentially this ownership flat like this. These are the types of weeks where I might lose more often than some other types of weeks, but also my ceiling when I win, what I win when I win, is just as high as, or maybe even higher than, other weeks. Because on a week like this, I really have to be more aggressive about chopping guys out of my player pool. I have to say, can this guy post that tournament winning score? No. But then I'll have a smaller pool of guys who are capable of it. But if very few guys from that pool actually end up doing it in the small sample size of this 1 week, well, then it's like, well, I just never really had a chance, right? But I'm not going to be building around. I have to choose on a week like this. I'm not going to be building around these guys who people are really just playing because they're comfortable. People are really just playing because they have this comfortable range of outcomes. They're never really going to post a tournament winner, but their bad score is not that bad, right? I'm going to let the field chase those, and I'm going to be looking for the guys. And it's not always going to be guys with broad range of outcomes. Sometimes the guys who can score 25 plus are also likely to put up a good score. Like Bijan Robinson can score 25 plus. He's also probably going to put up a good score, even if he doesn't score 25 plus. So there's plays like that. But then also there are going to be plays where you have to take this swing on somebody with a broader range of outcomes. And so I always want to be looking for guys like that this week. All right, with that, let's get to the bottom up build. So if you're new here, bottom up build, we build with a 44K salary cap. It's a good thought exercise, helps us to see some of the value on the slate. We have a 44K salary cap contest on OWS called the bottom up build. You can find the link to that in my player grid or in the BUB challenge channel on the OWS Discord server. So you go to the OWS Discord and then just click the BUB challenge channel. You'll find the link to the contest there. Rules are simple. Build with a 44K salary cap, and highest score, highest top three scores win money on OWS for courses and whatnot. So cool contest and just a great way to shape your thinking for the week. And one of the coolest things that we see in the bottom up build, what we've seen over the years, is there have been weeks where we get 200 plus points scored from bottom up build winners. So people who are spending 44K in salary cap and scoring 200 plus points. And it can really just open your eyes to how you can try to construct a roster to maximize as much ceiling as possible, to find the cheap guys who are not just capable of putting up 11 or 12, but are capable of putting up 25 to 30. Not to say that they're always going to get there, right? Why did we like Cedric Tillman so much last week? I had him on 80% of my rosters last week. I liked Cedric Tillman so much last week because he was capable of putting up 25 to 30. Now, we got fortunate that on the small sample size of 1 week, it actually happened. But the point is, I don't get excited about a cheap guy if it's like, yeah, he's got a good role and he's going to put up, 10, 11, 12 points really frequently at only 3K. That doesn't help you win a tournament. What helps you win a tournament is the really cheap guy who puts up 25 or 30. And even the 3K guy who puts up 20. If you get 20 points from a cheap guy, that separates you so much from the field. So we want to be thinking about not just who are the cheap guys, who you can put on a roster, but who are the cheap guys who can actually help separate. And so what we see from bottom up build winners a lot of times is they're finding a way to get cheaper guys who have true ceiling. And then they're also finding a way to carve in, even with a 44K salary cap, enough salary to get some higher priced guys who have true ceiling. So with that, let's take a look at my bottom up build for this week. We are going to start with, we'll get into him here. Let's talk about Matthew Stafford just real quickly. Dive in him in the player grid. But really quickly, Matthew Stafford has only played 10 games with Cooper Kupp, Puka Nacua, and Kyron Williams on the field together. Matthew Stafford averaged around 17 DraftKings points per game last year. He's averaged just under 13 DraftKings points per game this year. That's what the DraftKings pricing algorithm sees. That's what the field sees. What they don't see is when these three guys are on the field together, this is a very different offense. In 10 games, if we just took the 10 games where Stafford has had these three guys on the field with him, he would have the third highest average points per game of any quarterback on this slate, behind only Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. Also, Stafford's first 2 games with all three of these weapons were his 2 worst games with all three of these weapons. So if we just say his last 8 games, right? We're in week 9, we're 8 games into the season. So picture this. You're opening up the DraftKings app, you're looking at quarterbacks, you're looking through game logs. And you're looking at Geno Smith, and he's got a 22.6 pointer and another one of like 25 something, and then a bunch in the teens. And you're like, man, he always puts up kind of a decent score. And you're looking at all these other quarterbacks, and nobody really puts up 23 plus too often, but these guys sometimes do. And they, you like the guys who put up decent scores more often than not. And then you open up Matthew Stafford's game logs, and you see across these 8 games. So this is what his last 8 games with all three of these weapons has been. You look up Matthew Stafford's game logs, and across these 8 games, pretend it's all in this one season, he's got 8 games of 17 plus DraftKings points and 6 games of 23 plus DraftKings points. No other quarterback on this slate would look like that. And that's what Matthew Stafford has looked like across his last 8 games with all three of these guys. And he's in a great spot against this Seattle team that hasn't played well on defense, and divisional game on the road, right? So even though it looks like the Seahawks won't have DK Metcalf to really push the scoring pace back and forth in this one, it still is a spot where the Rams are going to have to stay aggressive trying to score points. And so, it's just Matthew Stafford with these guys. In fact, if we throw out those first 2 games, just say Stafford's last 8 games, the only quarterback who has averaged more points per game than Stafford has in these last 8 games with these 3 weapons is Lamar Jackson. So Matthew Stafford, 5,700. Now there's some nuance here, right? Stafford's not going to put up a 35-pointer, which some of these expensive quarterbacks can. There's also some cheap like Daniel Jones could put up 30 points. Dak Prescott can put up 35 points. So there are other guys to consider besides Stafford, but to me, Stafford is the bar that I'm comparing all other quarterbacks against. The quarterbacks who are priced around him and can just put up 17 to 23. Like I want Stafford because he's going to put up 23 way more consistently than these other guys. If I'm taking a different quarterback in this cheaper price range, it has to be a guy who's capable of scoring 30, 32, 35, or it has to be somebody who's way cheaper, like you could throw Gardner Minshew in there. He won't be for me. Or Bryce Young. You could throw Bryce Young in there. He's 4,400. So that's kind of how I'm looking at quarterback this week. Matthew Stafford, also all 10 of these games where all 3 of these Rams weapons played, at least one of them has put up like a really strong score. Most of them, 2 of them put up a really strong score. There's been like 6 or 7 of these games where like a true tournament winner score has emerged from one of these 3. So on this roster, we will pair Matthew Stafford with Puka Nacua. Does that tighten up our salary? Not really, because there's a decent amount of value this week. So we are going to look at some value here. We're going to throw Jalen Coker on this roster. Jalen Coker, who no Deontay Johnson. We got news that Adam Thielen's not playing. We know that the Saints offense has gotten Chris Olave back. They've gotten back 4/5 of their offensive line. They've gotten back Derek Carr. So good opportunity for the Saints to score points against the Panthers. For the Panthers to have to be passing, and for Jalen Coker to see anywhere from 6 to 10 targets. But I'll also say this. Like Xavier Legette, he's their first round draft pick, and maybe he has a big game, right? Maybe he emerges as sort of the alpha here. But Xavier Legette is not a nuanced short area route runner, which is what Adam Thielen was and is what Deontay Johnson is. And those are the guys that Bryce Young leaned on in the past, are guys who are a little bit more nuanced and are getting open in the shorter areas of the field. Xavier Legette also potentially matched up with Marshawn Lattimore on the outside. I still don't know if Lattimore is playing this week yet or not. I think he was still questionable last time I looked, but if he's matched up with Marshawn Lattimore, that's, not a great matchup for him. So not to say that Xavier Legette can't hit, but I can very much see Jalen Coker emerging as the guy who starts seeing 10 plus targets a game, similar to what we were getting from Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen. Coker's a guy who's not just filling in, he's a guy that they really like in this organization, in this team. So Jalen Coker, a guy who he's 3,600, but I don't just look at him through the lens of that 3,600 price tag. To me, he's more like a guy I would pay 4,700 for. So I feel like I'm just saving a significant amount of salary. Cedric Tillman, not in a great matchup against the Chargers, but in the role that he has and the talent that he has shown, he probably should be priced about 6,300. So I can look at him at 4,300 and say, man, I don't love this matchup, but I am saving $2K in salary in order to get him in this matchup. So Cedric Tillman, another guy who I like this week. Mike Gesicki, 3,100. Again, there's a lot of sharp value open this week. So Mike Gesicki, 3 games without T. Higgins. He's seen, I believe it was 5, 8, and 9 targets in those 3 games. And then when T. Higgins has been on the field, Gesicki kind of disappears. So Mike Gesicki, a guy who, remember when he was with the Dolphins, he and his agent tried to get him franchise tagged. When they were franchise tagging him, they tried to fight the tight end franchise tag and argue that he should be franchise tagged as a wide receiver, because that's basically what he is, and that's basically how teams tend to use him. So you're kind of getting a 3.1K wide receiver who's probably going to see 5 to 9 targets in the spot. Now, the Bengals should control this game, probably not a ton of passing volume, so probably more in like the 6 to 7 target range, but 3.1K, good wide receiver and a good offense who's going to see 6 plus targets. Mike Gesicki, really sharp value this week. So you see, we started with Stafford and Puka, but Stafford's not expensive. Puka is, but we were able to throw in Coker, Tillman, Gesicki, all guys who are really underpriced. And you see that we have a ton of salary flexibility here. So we're going to go one more cheap guy, and that's going to be Taysom Hill. So Taysom Hill, to me, we're consistently seeing RB2s against Carolina smash. Well, Taysom Hill is effectively the RB2 for the Saints. And every year, there's going to be a couple of games where Taysom Hill puts up 20 plus DraftKings points. And this could very easily be one of those games. So Taysom Hill, to me, just looks like a really nice ceiling play. Is there a possibility that he only scores 6 or 7 DraftKings points, 4 DraftKings points? Yeah, like 4 to 8 DraftKings points is within his range of outcomes. He's also a 3,800 tight end. It's not unusual for people to take 4 to 8 DraftKings points from their 3,800 tight end. So Taysom Hill, with the fact that we'll get low ownership, that the pathway to him having a big game is pretty clear, and that the ceiling is high. I really like Taysom Hill this week. So now we have Stafford, Puka, Coker, Tillman, Gesicki, Taysom Hill. I'll throw the Bills defense in here. I mentioned the struggles that Miami has had against this Bills defense. And that leaves us with quite a bit of salary at the running back position. We're able to fit in Bijan Robinson on this roster and Tyrone Tracy, a guy who looks like he's on track to clear concussion protocol and has taken over the lead running back role for the Giants. A really good running back, and like him this week at only 5,500. And altogether, we're spending 43.6K in salary. So that leaves 6.4K in salary left over with a roster that we really like. In fact, let's go through this. Like, let's say Stafford puts up 25. Let's say Puka puts up 30. That's 55 points right there. Let's say Bijan Robinson puts up 25. Let's say Tyrone Tracy puts up 20. We're up to 100 points from this starting point on our roster. Then let's say that Jalen Coker, Cedric Tillman, Mike Gesicki, and Taysom Hill, that 2 of these guys managed to score 20 and 2 of them managed to score 15. Well, all of a sudden, we're at 170 points on this roster. Throw in the Bills defense, say they get another 10. That's 180 points on this roster with 43.6K in salary spent. Now, that's not to say that that's what this roster is going to score. That's not to say that that's what all these guys are going to produce, but I'm just illustrating that we're not pushing the projection on any of these guys. Stafford has scored 23 plus in 6 of his last 8 games with all these weapons. Saying he scores 25 is pretty reasonable. Saying Bijan Robinson scores 25 against Dallas is pretty reasonable. Saying Tyrone Tracy scores 20, Puka scores 30, Coker scores 15, Tillman scores 20, Gesicki scores 15, Taysom scores 20. Now, we're talking cheaper guys, so it starts to get a little bit more thin with how frequently they would do that, but those ceilings are there on these guys, and the ceiling is higher on all these guys than what we even just painted there. So, like, it's possible that Bijan puts up 32. It's possible that Puka puts up 35. It's possible that Tillman puts up 25 to 30. So, point being, we can build one of these rosters and see how much ceiling we're actually collecting on here with a lot of salary left over. And then that kind of allows us to say, oh, wow, like, what pieces would we want to take off here and add other pieces on to build like a real 50K salary cap roster for a contest. So that is this week's bottom up build. And that is this week's Angles podcast. As always, thanks for hanging out. Again, reminder, you can use that OWS 40 code and get 40% off an Inner Circle subscription. That'll also get you 10 days of access to Props Insider for free. That access is going to expire on November 12th. So today's November 1st. You would want to get that code today so you get the full 10 days of access. And with that, I am going to get out of here. I will see you on the site throughout the weekend, and I will see you at the top of the leaderboards on Sunday.